reminding us that we too could have a really prosperous fishing industry if we had control of it. That the Norwegians managed to have both higher conservation levels than Scotland and more people employed in fishing and more net gain from fishing than us. And much of that seems to be because of Spanish ingress. I mean, we know this, the fishermen have been complaining about this for a long time. But the point is, if we want to keep the fishing stocks up, never mind just the trade, and that's important too, we could be running our fisheries dramatically differently. When it comes to common agricultural policy, you might notice that there are some things that are very unequally distributed in Scotland, and one of them is land, particularly farmland. Now, you can't necessarily blame the common agricultural policy for this, but you can certainly point out that when there are huge inequities in a system, the common agricultural policy just tops it up quite nicely in many respects. So we have a system where there are slipper farmers. This is where quotas are involved, quotas can be traded, and you don't actually need to be actively farming to get the money in from the subsidies. In fact, you don't even need to be living in Scotland. There are slipper farmers who own very large bits of land, or who sometimes are renting bits of it and owning bits of it, but whatever, the key point is they have quota, and they're living in the south of Spain, getting common agricultural policy subsidies. The same is true with the common fisheries policy. It's a bizarre idea, slipper fishermen, who are doing the same thing. They're off in the south of Spain, a lot of them. Now, come on, wake up, folks. You know, we are so distanced from the land, and in many fishing communities, there are no Scots fishing anymore. There are a couple of owners, and the rest of the boats are staffed by people from Eastern Europe or Filipinos who sleep on the boats and are paid something like, £3 a day, get home once a year. That's the Scottish fishing industry. Is that what we want? Well, I mean, if you wanted to rattle the cage, if you wanted to reorder some things, you might begin to look at the way that these European policies have fixed the patterns of unequal distribution in Scotland, and you might begin to think that you might usefully do with a bit of a kind of cold turkey period where you get a hold of those powers again, and you decide what activities you want to subsidise. You decide, in Scotland, we decide what size and type of farmer we want to encourage. We decide these things, because at the moment, we're not. So there's kind of those arguments for being a bit like the North Atlantic states saying, do you know, the EU? Nah. Let's just go for the EEA. Okay, we've got to pay money to get into the single market, but whatever, at least we have access to it. We don't have all the problematic bits. We still have freedom of movement. We still have a good turnover of people from Europe. Sounds fine. That sounds great. And actually the Nordics, just to say, however, the Nordics had this outlook about the benefits of freedom much earlier than the European Union. And the Nordic travel area was set up 40 years before Schengen. So in fact, a lot of the Nordic countries that are not in the EU have opted into Schengen simply to make it easier for other Nordic neighbours to travel, because they think it's so important to be able to move effortlessly between their countries. But then let's just take a look at the other option, which is full EU membership. The other option to this is the full Buna, is European Union membership. And obviously the Finns are very in there, but actually at the same time so are the Swedes and the Danes. And the Danes have been quite sort of Eurosceptic members. They've had more referendums on bits of European policy than anybody else in the EU. And the Swedes were quite reluctant joiners. They joined later than other people, mostly because they have such an extraordinary welfare state that they imagined that any new regulations put through by the EU would only bring their standards down. Now, it just speaks volumes about how we've all lived our lives over the last century, that the EU could be perceived as being something that would bring standards down. Because, of course, in Scotland, we all think that it brings standards up. It's the only reason that there was ever any limit to the working day. The Working Time Directive was something that brought an awful lot of common sense, as we would say in Scotland, into a Thatcherite world at the time. But the Swedes were very worried about how the EU would basically erode their standards. So they were reluctant to come in, but they began to think eventually that there was no point having a squeaky clean kind of Sweden with the people's home and great state provision if you weren't pushing the boat out for socialism a bit further afield. And just by the by, their economy was stagnating too. So here we have another possibility, which is a cluster of little northern states, all of whom could make a decision to change the European Union. And Sweden in particular is in an interesting place at the moment because it has a new government whose deputy prime minister you might have seen on social media, Isabella Lövin. You might have seen her in a picture where she was signing an executive order flanked by a whole bunch of women, basically taking the piss out of Donald Trump. But actually, which executive order was quite interesting because it was one redoubling Sweden's commitment to climate change. And what she said was quite interesting because she said, we can now forget, if we ever took it seriously, the idea of a progressive American lead in the world. For the next 4 to 5 years, it's gone. If there's going to be any sort of thought leadership in the world, where is it going to come from? And at the risk of sounding a bit up ourselves, as Europeans can often do, you know, knocking out the whole world apart from ourselves, well, there's the European Union. And so the Swedes have decided that for the benefit of the world, for the benefit of saving the climate, for the benefits of trying to extend ideas of social protection, they are redoubling their efforts to change the European Union. The Swedes, the Danes, the Finns. There's a little band of countries, they all have populations of 5 million, they all have extremely good welfare provision, they all have a like-minded attitude and a success rate, and then there's Scotland. Now, you know, when I've looked at this again and again, I wouldn't be sure myself from the amount I know at the moment, which isn't very much, but is perhaps a bit more than others who haven't thought this way yet. I don't know what should be the best option, but you know, actually, it's a great thing to have those options in front of you and to see that there are viable models for whatever you decide your national interest to be. And the thing is, at this event, when there was people from every different, you know, one of these countries there was nobody from Finland trying to say to the folk of the Faroes, you guys should come into the European Union now, you know, you spent enough time out in the cold, or vice versa. People could see that the Finns were in a particular position. They can understand, the most anti-European Union people can understand the Finns' desire to have that as a common security policy. And equally, the Finns can entirely understand why the Icelanders with their boisterous 200-mile limit, or the Faroese, you know, with 90% of their income coming from fish, wouldn't look twice at the European Union as it's currently constituted. The question that we haven't gone through in Scotland is what is in our interests? How are our interests best served? What proportion of our national income, or the vitality of our country, or keeping people in coastal communities, what proportion of that is served by fishing? Is there a chance that we could actually argue, negotiate better than the UK for fishing for Scotland if we were independent? Kind of, you betcha. But still, so could Norway, and they decided not to go in and take the chance. They just stayed clear of the entire policy. Is the EU right for change? I mean, its leadership is saying that it suspects that it will change. Some of them say they don't think it will even survive. Those people who are members of the EEA and EFTA say that it will probably be more stable than the EU in the next while, and that might be another argument for getting stuck accidentally in a permanent halfway house. But the thing is, if we don't start to think like this, you know, think actively about which way our interests might best be served, we're not beginning to think like people who live in the early days of a better nation. We're not thinking over that minor problem of independence to the bigger issue of what contribution we make in the world and where we place ourselves. And in the way that any decent mover gets a little bit warmed up before they start, we should be thinking at the moment beyond the first set of issues that confront us about independence, because actually, when you start to describe the types of decision and power that you might have, and the parallels that we might then rightfully be able to draw between ourselves and some of our Nordic neighbours, it gets interesting. You know, it gets exciting, even potentially. And actually, we're going to need that. Because otherwise, people reckon they've done this one already. They've already been through an independence referendum. We're already getting, the press are coming out with these same old, you know, stuff, currency. And that's all we'll get, a technical debate, a set of displacements from the real deal down to little dressage event, you know, like in a Platz at a place you lose 10 points type stuff. We're not in a blinking dressage event. We're in life, and it's got courses and pulses, and it's bigger than all of this. But if we're not going out demonstrating how that's true, why should we expect the public to get excited? So it's strange, here we are tonight on a Thursday night when it's a bit Baltic apart from certain talented people in front of here. And we're all sitting here gathered to talk about Europe, Laura, you know? I mean, something has changed already, but I think the thing to do is to try to further occupy that space with the interest it really has. And it does, because the final thing to say is that attitudes, just as we're beginning to think, do you know something? Maybe there's another destination, maybe there's another European club worth considering apart from the EU. Just as we're beginning to think like that, the EU is beginning to get a bit come hither. You know, they were a bit sniffy the first time round, but actually now they've worked it out. They're going to lose England, they just are. So actually, what do you want to do? Just lose everybody, or just kind of like, you know, booby prize Scotland? 5 million people. We're we're the most, in the same way as the only person that can prove their sanity is someone recently released from an asylum. The Scots are the only ones who can prove they're keen on Europe. You know, we've joined. We will be the most recent ones to actively, in the middle of all this stuff, after Greece, after disappointments, and all that stuff, we in cold, you know, sanity, choose to join this blinking thing. That's pretty impressive. And there's resources here, massive energy resources. You wouldn't want to lose us. Not to mention the whiskey. So there's reasons that Europe is just warming up a little bit. The Jacqueline Miner, who is the EU representative in Britain, she was the one who last time round said that Scotland would be in the queue with Montenegro, Serbia and everybody else. She's now realised, which of course she always could have done, that because Scotland has been a member of the EU, it already has embodied in it EU law. It already observes the 4 acquis, the freedoms. In fact, we're already European up here. And that means we skip right to the front of the queue, Begorra. Well, it's funny because we were still European the last time round, 2014, but hey, bygones, you know. So there's been more. You could list the number of people who have done pretty well about turns. Guy Verhofstadt, who's the chief negotiator, the Brexit negotiator on behalf of the EU, sent a sort of love message to Scotland on Valentine's Day, which was really sweet, and the whole text is in there, I can't remember it. But basically, he's paying great tribute to the Scots internationalist outlook, to our inventive past, and to the possibilities of putting that all together within Europe. You know, people will soon be falling over themselves to try and get the Scots to walk their way. We're not nothing. We're a catch. So, you know, things have changed, and we need to kind of get our heads together on that and get a bit excited about the possibilities. So, that's all I've got to say.
So there you go, that was Lesley. I think there's definitely a lot to think about in there. Just a few thank yous before we go. Thank you to the people who left generous donations recently. It's much appreciated. If you want to do that, the donate button's on my website. Thank you to Lesley for letting me reproduce the talk, and thank you to the person who runs the video channel, Gomni, who uploaded the original video. Now, just before we go, there's another little thing that happened recently that I can't not mention. This is the President of the United States of America.
The President of China, you're launching these military strikes. Was that planned? How did that come about that it's happening right then? Because right there you're saying a reminder, here's who the superpower in the world is.
You have no idea how many people want to hear